Thank you, Professor Carosa. I believe that it is not only my impression that your presentation is very impressive, and if I can say, I am surprised as a young man is such experienced and sapient, trying to formulate not only precise concept, but also paper based on the living cases of core decisions and so on. Thank you very much. Now, room for discussion. Yeah. Professor Matlari first.
Thank you very much for this very interesting intervention and paper. And this is, of course, a theme we have touched on a lot in the academy. And human rights was such a, should one say, liberating and important concept in international politics from about 1990, the end of the Cold War. And one saw how this was more and more invoked in international affairs. However, all these UN conferences, all the debate about all the political activity around human rights has now become less important. This is also a problem, yet we have seen how this tendency to use human rights, to rights talk, has become a really big problem in both national and international affairs, including the role of the Strasbourg Court, for instance, where one, without any duty concept, without any anthropological basis of human rights, it becomes every interest you have is a new human right. And this is extremely disconcerting because the power of Stephen Luke's, the power of gender setting, the power concepts or the power analysis of Michel Foucault, the framing of an issue, this is highly relevant to seeing or to understanding how human rights becomes an irresistible tool of political power. And there are now human rights to children. There's a human right to have children. This is a common parlance in Norwegian politics. I'm writing something about against surrogacy and the right to donate eggs and semen and so on, which is in the current politics. So I'm interested in just asking you this question of, you mentioned the Strasbourg Court has given a new human right, recognized a new human right to artificially create human beings. What exactly is this?
So what I refer to in there, which has been confirmed by the Inter-American Court as well, specifically is the right to use techniques of in vitro fertilization in order to generate new human lives. It does not yet include surrogacy, but I think the jurisprudential principles that the court has applied in the in vitro fertilization cases inevitably lead to the same conclusion in the case of surrogacy, and it's just a question of time. As I'm sure you know, the European Court of Human Rights, for reasons that are very understandable and in some senses quite laudable, has historically always allowed itself to be guided by the dominant practice of the states that are members of the Council of Europe. So as soon as there is an adequate consensus among the member states, which is not a universal consensus, but just a majority, the court then moves in the same direction. So I believe that the jurisprudence on surrogacy is really only a question of time. In the inter-American system, the in vitro fertilization right has been recognized, notwithstanding very explicit and strong language in the American Convention that protects the right to life from the moment of conception, which the court has virtually interpreted to be non-existent.
Yeah. Thank you for this point, and now second is Professor Hösle.
Thank you, Paolo, for a very enlightening lecture. I would like to add a fifth reason to why the legal system is not, the human rights system is not sufficient to address the issues we are concerned here. It resonates with what Pierpaolo was saying before. Every lawyer says the most frustrating cases where you are involved are neighborhood disputes, divorce cases, and inheritance cases. Why? Because what is at stake is not the money that you get from the parents, but old problems come up. One child felt that he was always less loved than the other child, and these problems can simply not be settled by law. There is no way. Law can only, as Kant understood very clearly, settle issues that have to do with external things. But love, affection, friendship cannot be enforced. Otherwise, they are not love, affection. And the problem of exclusion is to a large amount a problem of the right attitude towards people, and that is beyond the pale of the law.
So even though it's not exactly a question, may I comment very, very briefly on this, because I think that's quite an important point that is confirmed also in the very large issues of international human rights. The example that immediately comes to mind is all of the jurisprudence relating to political amnesty after periods of dictatorship and transition. The courts, the Inter-American Court in particular, have taken very rigid approaches to the illegitimacy of amnesty laws. Whereas, in fact, the societies that are riven by questions of the need for forgiveness, the need for reconciliation, often recognize, as historically been the case since the most ancient records that we have of political conflict and warfare, of the need for forgetting. Precisely in order to allow the possibility of friendship and relationship to be born again. So it just confirms the bad fit, in some sense, between the formality of legal norms and the need for human relationship.
Thank you very much. It's a question for both speakers this morning. I was reminded of the distinction that the legal philosopher Charles Fried made many years ago between positive and negative rights. And it's a problematic distinction, except in extreme cases. Think of the positive being claimed to something, some material good or the other, and negative being some particular imposition be withheld. And I was wondering, in these two papers, excellent papers on social exclusion, whether you think, is there some sense in which one set of rights, the negative rights, are in some sense, at the extreme cases I can understand because they get blurred, in non-extreme cases, are they easier to deal with, and the violation of the incidence of social exclusion, and let me put it this way, is the incidence of social exclusion predominantly geared to the violation of positive rights as opposed to negative rights?
Thank you. I also want to say, first of all, how much I appreciated your wonderful contribution, Paolo. Very good. And I want to insist on the issue raised by Professor Dasgupta. Positive rights implies that somebody has to do something. And they correspond to what the Pope says in his address to the Council of Europe. We neglect duties because rights demand duties. The problem is, I think, to a large extent, the problem of determining who has the corresponding duties. And I see here that there is a problem, not easy to be solved, because the natural tendency is to say the state carries all the duties corresponding to rights, which is wrong, because this implies that the state should have all powers. In order to satisfy all duties, the demands of all rights, the state should have all powers, which is not desirable. In our European experience, one of the main issues on this point is what is the duty that corresponds to the Union, what to the member states, what to the regions, what to the families, and what to the individuals. if we do not succeed in seeing that social rights require for their satisfaction the coordination of a plurality of subjects, and each one of them has to take its share of responsibility, it becomes extremely difficult to give to social rights a more than only rhetorical recognition. How do you see the problem of the division, let us say, of social rights among the different instances, not excluded the subject himself? If you consider the debate in Germany on the Hartz laws, to a large extent it is the laws on unemployment. To a large extent it is the debate on what must be demanded out of the unemployed. He also must cooperate. Otherwise, his right to work, for instance, cannot receive any reasonable answer. And until we do not make a distinction of levels, it will be very difficult for the courts also to find answers. And a second question, if I may, human rights are the rights of man, but what is man? I see that to a large extent, this is the problem today. Yesterday I had a debate on euthanasia, and my opponent said, I belong to myself. And I said, that's wrong. It is evident, it is apparent that it is wrong. Why is it wrong? Because your will, but your will changes from one day to another day, and is largely dependent on the influence of others. And is dependent on the relation to the people who love you, and is dependent on the influence of the mass media and of the social powers that want to direct you in one direction or in another direction. And the principle that you affirm is exactly the principle against which Rerum Novarum was written. Not Evangelii Gaudium, not Centesimus Annus, Rerum Novarum. If you imagine that the worker in front of the big company is free and he has the right to determine himself, he will be destroyed. He needs to be supported by a law that says, for instance, that there is a minimum wage, and so forth. Excuse me for being too long.
Well,
yeah. No, I want to say only something. Of course, congratulations for the very nice text. But I don't, what is your idea about, for example, the new objective of the development proposed by the United Nations? What kind of value juridical for you have? Because it's very important in relation just to the participation, in relation to the poverty, in relation to the nature, the climate, and these things that are not in the courts, international courts, and not in the other legislation. And these are very important. So, in concretely, I come back to Hegel to say we need some kind of revolution, some kind of oppression. In the contrary, the law not arrive to have a relation with the needs of the people.
Yeah.
1 minute.
I confess I am under pressure. So, Margaret Archer, 1 minute. 1 minute, Stefano Zamagni, please.
Just a partial agreement, partial disagreement. Analytically, I think, Rocco, you are perfectly correct. But if we think in terms of social dynamics, there I would want to disagree with you over time. Because simply, if you take the example of equal pay for equal work, how did that get onto the EU agenda? Through several individual women in Ireland registering a complaint about discrimination by men against women in terms of payment. From there, the dynamics engage, and you're absolutely correct, I believe, that this became a generalized issue. But there is this question of how do things get onto the agenda? And sometimes that has to be through individuals putting it there. That's all.
Yeah.
Paolo.
I mean that this question is just proper for coffee break. Sorry.
Just
1 minute for
1
Stefano.
minute. Paolo, he said social inclusion as human right. I agree. But what would you say to those people and to those many countries who do not admit the notion of human rights, but they admit the notion of rights of men? Because one thing is a right of man, another thing is a human right. You know that. And so there are many countries in the world which have not yet realized the human rights declaration. In that case, what would you suggest as a possible way of dialogue? Because there is a lot of confusion. People, they say human rights, in other words, rights of man, but it's not true. They are opposite, one from the other.
Now please, Professor Carosa, a very short conclusion of this presentation, please.
I'll do my best. There's many good and profound questions. I'll take them in order and only briefly. So on the question of positive and negative rights, while yes, cautiously one might say that social exclusion is more a question of positive rights, I'm very hesitant to endorse the distinction in general that Fried and others have made between them. I think it's a distinction that obscures and takes for granted the position that we have been in, those of us who live in relatively institutionally healthy and wealthy societies. Because even those rights that we have regarded as negative rights depend enormously on the positive actions of the state to maintain. So think of the right not to be abused in prison, for example, requires massive investments and maintenance of a system of prison with humane conditions. And this is important to realize the positive aspect of even what are traditionally negative rights in social exclusion, because in so much of the world, the problem is the absence of the capacity of the state. And that incapacity then affects dramatically even those rights that we would historically regard as negative rights. Secondly, with respect to Rocco's comments about different levels of addressing it, in the interest of time, I skipped over in my paper the reference to subsidiarity, but the way that the international human rights system has historically tried to mediate between those various levels is, in fact, by the principle of subsidiarity. It's structured into international human rights. It's not merely an arcane principle of Catholic social teaching, but is essential to the actual apparatus of human rights and needs to be made even more so. I'll only add, in light of the comment about it yesterday, that we, in order to do so, we can't understand human subsidiarity merely as meaning a form of devolution and localization, obviously. It is rather essentially a form of assistance towards primary communities in realizing the good of their members. Third, the Millennium Development Goals, Chancellor Sanchez-Sorondo. Goal 16, as you know, refers to strong institutions and human rights. And that, to me, is exactly right. In other words, human rights must be situated within the development goals, not serve as the lens or vehicle through which to look at all of the MDGs, which is what some human rights organizations are advocating that we do. But precisely for the reasons that I presented in the paper, if we situate them within a larger context of human development and human flourishing, they will have their proper but limited place. And finally, with respect to Margaret's illustration of how equal pay came forward, I think this adds a very valuable and accurate description of one of the positive roles that individual contentious cases in the international system can have here. In fact, it's not so much that the courts or committees and commissions themselves are capable of devising structural answers to the overall problem. But as it were, they can serve as the canary in the coal mine. They can, through an individual case, raise an issue, identify a problem, and by doing so, help to open up a debate, but which then must take place at a larger social and political level in other institutions for it to be adequately addressed. I don't really have an answer to Professor Zamani's question of how do we persuade those countries which, and societies which have not accepted, to put it in different terms, the natural basis and universal basis of rights and ascribe to them only positivistic principles. I think that's an ongoing struggle of education, frankly, that we face. Thank you.